Alright, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you've been amazing. Welcome to the second day of the Telos Bootcamp, and yeah, let's get into it. But firstly, I'd just like to appreciate everyone who was able to join us for the Twitter Space yesterday, as well as being able to participate or take part in the first bootcamp session. So maybe just a couple of announcements as well. For those of you who want to get more information about the hackathon happening next week, feel free to join us in our Telegram groups as well, or even in WhatsApp, and you'll be able to get a lot more information about what we've been able to achieve and what we'll be working on for next week. A number of you already reached out talking about some ideas you have for your projects, about the types of team you want to have, which is amazing. And we're basically looking forward to that and seeing what you can build. So, moving on swiftly. So, for today's session, just similarly to what we did yesterday, we talked about a basic introduction to Telos and what Telos is from JT, the co-founder of the blockchain, as well as just learning more about what exactly makes Telos unique, what makes people actually sit back and think, okay, this is actually a good project for me to actually set up my dApps in, or maybe start a new venture within this particular space. And we also managed to take a look at different apps that are currently there in the ecosystem, the roadmap we've had in 2023, and also just a brief vision or overview of what's going to be happening in now 2024 and beyond, which is pretty amazing, and basically looking forward to seeing more of that as well. So just as an addition to that, today we'll be looking at Telos consensus mechanism and architecture. What's behind the scenes in terms of what Telos is about, how it's built, and what exactly was the vision that actually enables us devs to actually build some really cool stuff or amazing projects specifically that can impact our region as well as our local communities here as well, which is kind of the main vision or focus of us going about this today. So just simply put, the agenda is I'm going to talk about three things specifically. We're going to talk about Telos EVM. There's also the Telos Zero, which I'll mention briefly, but I won't get into that too much. But as a dev, the EVM is basically your bread and butter. This is where we'll be interacting a lot in terms of Telos in this ecosystem. We're also looking at governance in terms of when you say that Telos is purely decentralized, what exactly do we mean and how do we achieve that? And finally, we'll just taking a look at the consensus mechanism behind Telos and what are basically the nitty-gritties behind that as well. So I think that's basically just a rundown of what we're covering for today, and basically, yeah, let's get into it. So in terms of Telos EVM, one thing that I can talk about or that I can mention now would be how Telos basically offers advanced solutions to tackle the issues encountered by developers and users on other layer 1 blockchains. And some of these main issues that we've seen in the past basically would be in terms of the performance, in terms of speed, the scalability, in terms of, okay, how much data can I actually put on this chain? And also in terms of high energy consumption, where you realize that Telos is one of actually the really green blockchain or layer 2 solutions out there. So you'll find that basically there's already a space that we're in currently, and Telos is basically the next step in terms of this is how we can actually use a blockchain, and this is the vision of how the space is going to be looking like for the next couple of years as well. And there are just a couple of things I'd like to note or highlight with regards to Telos. Firstly, remember how I talked about there being the layer 1 or the native Telos network. So the Telos EVM, which basically stands for the Telos Ethereum Virtual Machine, is now basically a smart contract that's been implemented on the Telos network. And this is really cool because it basically means that one smart contract has basically been enabled us to or enable the implementation of the Telos EVM. And this is actually really important because one key thing about this smart contract is that it also ensures that the gas fees remain constant, meaning that they don't change or increase, meaning that eliminates a number of issues that other blockchain networks have, which is ideally what we talk about when we say front running, in terms of this is what affects the speed of execution, as well as now the fixed gas rates within other blockchain networks. And maybe just to give you like a slight visual example of what I mean when I talk about front running. So let's say you're trying to make a transaction on any other blockchain network. It can be an Ethereum L2 or even an L1 blockchain. But basically what happens is if someone is able to detect a transaction and see, all right, this is how much I've spent in terms of gas fees, I can basically look at it and be like, okay, let me increase the price or the fee I'm willing to pay for this transaction such that my transactions would run before yours. And this would bring a lot of issues within a network, especially in terms of the fairness and the equity within the network, and that's something that we can't be having. So that's one of the key focuses that we look at when we talk about front running. And just going to take you back to the previous slide as well, and another key thing that comes up through being able to implement such a EVM is that you get 30 times the speed of Ethereum, give or take, in terms of how your transactions can be processed, even in terms of scalability and the capacity that you can have. You find that that's almost 100 times that. And like I said, as a developer and even as a business or business owner or entrepreneur, you look at gas fees and think, if I'm able to know I have a fixed rate and a fixed constant, that makes my life so much easier when I'm thinking about how am I going to go about developing my dApps, how am I going to go about budgeting or planning for a particular venture that I'm looking into as well. So which are some of the key things that we notice when you talk about Telos EVM specifically as well. And also, I'll just be taking a look at the questions in the chat and also trying to figure out, okay, what are your thoughts on this as well as we continue going on and engaging. I'd also love to hear more of what you're thinking or anything that you'd like to know with regards to the specifics of what we'll be talking about today. Then, I think one more thing I'd also love to mention is how you find that, sorry about that, one other key benefit of actually interacting in the Telos ecosystem and also looking to build your own dApps or projects is that you don't want to have the hassle of having a hard time of, do I need to learn new technologies, do I need to learn how to use different tools that maybe I've never interacted with before. But given the fact that Telos runs this EVM and is part of the whole larger Ethereum ecosystem, you find that tools that maybe if you already started out your journey as a smart contracts developer or a Web3 dev, it makes it so much easier for you to get started. And some of these tools are hard hat and truffle, because I think the first smart contract I ever did was actually on Remix, which you can also use on Telos, by the way. But with time, I got more used to using hard hat and truffle as well. So that's some of the key, or actually the cool things that I think I picked up when getting into Telos, and I think that's actually pretty. It's actually a big advantage in my opinion, The other thing would be in terms of, just because of, given the fact that it runs the EVM, you find that you can actually write your smart contracts in Solidity as well, which is a language that maybe if you're getting started with in blockchain, is one of the more accommodative and encouraging ones to get started. So like I'm saying here, Solidity devs, you can rest easy. You don't have to worry too much about something complicated that maybe might hinder you when you're trying to get started in developing on Telos as well. And one other key thing that we'll talk about when you're talking about how do I get started in building in Telos is what are the libraries that are available for me now to interact with this EVM. And you find that you have access to the same things such as the JSON RPC, which I'll talk about briefly in the next few moments as well as other JS libraries like Web3.js or Ethers.js, which you would find you'd interact with a lot, even in your own development journey as well. And the reason I talked about JSON RPC is it's not something too complicated, but it's basically what allows different apps that we use to interact with a node that is running on this particular setup. So maybe just to stop there briefly, I'm seeing a question on the chat from Keith talking about how, what if I want to use Laravel in terms of building an application. I think you can be creative with it. Specifically, what I would tell you is if you can merge Laravel with something like a JavaScript frontend, which now will allow you to interact with the blockchain. But then now for Laravel, maybe you split up some of those particular functions. It's pretty possible. Only your creativity will limit you, to be honest. So if that's what you think, if that's where your background is as well, think about how can I actually implement this, because that's also an interesting way of looking at it as well. So thanks for that question as well. And just going back to what I was mentioning about the JSON RPCs, is when you find that JSON is basically a format or a way of sending messages such that different computers can understand them and use them to translate what exactly is happening. So how that would look, if I was to put it in a simple setting, is maybe you have a client which would now be your phone or the wallet app that you're running on your phone as well. Maybe it's or even your browser like MetaMask or something like that. You'd find that the messages that are sent to the server that connects to the Telos node in this case would basically be sending messages in this JSON format. So RPC in that sense means a remote procedural call, such that when a message is sent, a specific type of response is also expected, which is actually something that I think is key and really interesting to note as well. And just know on that as well, you'll find that even the EVM RPC or the Ethereum Virtual Machine remote procedural call, like I mentioned before, will act as a language translator for the different blockchain applications running within this ecosystem. So it will also help different programs understand each other, and also plays a critical role in terms of translating those native APIs to the standard EVM RPC methods that now you'll be interacting with as well. And another key thing to note is all EVM tools and wallets will be compatible within this specific setting. So MetaMask users, you can rest easy as well. You'll be good to go. And I think just based on that, I've given like a brief introduction or overview in terms of when we talk about the Telos EVM. You find that there's also a specific model. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here and there. I'm not going to go too in-depth into it, but you'll find that there are some key things that you will note that will make you understand that, hey, okay, so these are how it actually works, and these are the different components that we can interact with. It's a basic example that you can actually find access to it and take a look at it in all the docs that will be made available to you as well in the Telos system or ecosystem as well, and that's actually something that's pretty cool. So just looking at this particular application, I'll go from left to right, where I'll talk about the dApps and the user wallets, which I talked about. Think about them as now what the end user will be using and interacting with specifically. And this is where you'll find that maybe you're sending those requests to the JSON RPC API that basically interfaces with the Ethereum node and allows you to send communication or messages to the blockchain that can be processed. Then you get back that information as well. And on the other side, you'll find there's also the P2P network, which I'm going to talk about briefly as well as we continue. And basically, this is just a description of what I've talked about in the previous images, where I'll come in and mention that for starters, the dApps and the user wallets are what you'll use to set up a connection with the Ethereum node using the JSON RPC, kind of as the translator or the API service in this sense. Then what the node offers you is basically a gateway and also manages the states and logs the databases for the API users as well. So the state database is what stores the current network status and enables smart contracts to read and update data with Telos storing state information in RAM for faster access as well. So that just means that another thing to consider in terms of when you're building your app, there are actually mitigations in terms of just to deal with lag or any other thing that may slow down your applications and how they run specifically. Then there's also logs in terms of seeing specific events that have happened, which is important in terms of tracking token transfers, or basically integrating with centralized exchanges and maintaining transaction histories, which is pretty much important, specifically in terms of ensuring the availability of this data and also of your services as well. Then there's the different communication channels between dApps and user wallets, which can occur through in-browser or basically a wallet connect protocol, which we'll be looking at when we go through this specific labs as well. Then I think one thing that I would mention here would also be talking about how to now accessing the blockchain data, where both dApps and wallets access the blockchain states and logs by interacting with the Ethereum JSON RPC API that I just mentioned, that basically acts like the mediator or the translator in this particular setting. So that was just a brief overview in terms of what we're looking at when we talk about the Telos EVM model. There's so much more that you can go through and read to learn more about, but those are some of the key things that I found pretty interesting. And I think it takes me back to something I was thinking about some time back when I was still learning about Ethereum. There's this meme that I saw once when they talking about how first of all, I'm a massive Lord of the Rings fan. So when I was thinking about this, I was like, it basically said one chain to rule them all. And I was thinking about how sometimes consensus and governance doesn't work as decentralized as it's supposed to be in that particular context. And what you'll find that there are different loopholes that people can take advantage of to gain a small advantage for maybe other users within the blockchain ecosystem or within that specific setup. But with Telos, with this unique approach in terms of governance and consensus, you'll find that there's a lot of mitigations for that, which I think is key and which I think is pretty much very important as we continue discussing more about how we actually get started on building within the Telos ecosystem. And I think one more thing I'd also like to mention as well is in terms of now the specific governance model. So how Telos has gone about it, or how the team went about it, is firstly, you'll think about how does this model benefit all the users or all the participants within this network. And that's where I think they got the idea of, token holders and block producers basically are the key stakeholders in this particular setup, where you find that they can make off-chain decisions while smart contracts execute the on-chain actions. So in order to make this possible, they use something called the Telos Decide Engine, which we'll talk about more as we continue with this specific session. So what it basically does is it puts the network operations in the hands of the token holders in terms of you decide what happens within this particular network. And those token holders, basically the native token of Telos, in terms of that's what we call it, can participate in all governance related matters on chain. So besides choosing the block producers, different drafts of vote proposals can be made and all the holders can take part in that as well. So another thing to note is also, in order for this governance setup to work, you'll find that these rules need to be defined somewhere, and they're defined in the system's contracts. And basically it's a suite of contracts defining the core of the Telos network in terms of this is what we can actually do here. And you find that any change to the system contracts must go through specific code reviews, block producer acceptance, and also governance acceptance, in such that it's not just you go through one specific step then you're good to go. What happens is that you basically find that every stakeholder within the ecosystem must be able to have a say in terms of what exactly is happening. And the people who built this are basically called the Telos core developers, who basically work on the system contracts, and they basically chain funded. and they can be paid or dismissed based on the voting and the things that people talk about. I've seen a question in the chat from Huxley talking about what is the security of Telos. So I think once I'm done with this, I'll get more into that. So I can also just discuss more on the particular components of that. But this first part that I'm talking about in terms of governance is one of the key things that you need to consider. Security comes from how do I make sure that the system remains fair and no one can take advantage of what we have, and giving participants the ability to vote and also to basically decide on that. What happens on the chain themselves is one of the key things that actually build up or lead to that as well. So thank you for that as well, but we'll get into it more as we continue. Then another key thing is in terms of, since it's a blockchain, you're also dealing with data and transactions and actually building blocks in order to form these particular chains. And you have to make sure that when these blocks or transactions actually produced, you find that they need to be validated firstly, and they also need to make sure that they are not tampered with. And part of the key things, or one of the key stakeholders in this process, will now be the block producers themselves. And what happens in terms of voting for someone who can actually now produce blocks in the system is through something we call inverse weighted, meaning that, for example, if you only vote for one or two block producers, that really shows that there's a level of bias in terms of what you have in mind within this particular ecosystem. But what happens is, if you vote for more than 20 or even 30 of these producers, your vote will have more weight than if you voted for one or two. And this is just to ensure that at least there's no bias or there's no fix in terms of there being a specific group of people who are producing blocks within the network. And just like I mentioned here, it encourages the majority of the members to become more educated about block producer candidates and discourages those who only want to seek to vote for themselves and their affiliates, which is actually a problem that exists in a lot of proof of work blockchains, which I'll also get into as we continue. And in order for you to be a block producer, you need to be eligible. And this eligibility is done basically following a couple of standards that I've set in the ecosystem. And just getting into these standards, you'd find that it's basically based on the security, server capacity, information disclosure, and your participation in both the public and the private testnet, basically. So what happens is, before you actually become a producer on the mainnet, you would need to interact with the testnet for a couple of weeks without having any errors before you can actually move on to producing blocks on the mainnet. These standards are also enforced within the specific smart contracts, and sorry about that. From the time of mainnet activation, and any block producer candidate that is not compliant will not be capable of serving, regardless of the votes that they receive. So if you don't comply with those particular rules or standards that have been enforced, unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to produce any blocks. And all other block producer candidates will rise up the block producing ranks until the minimum requirements are met. So those are just some of the key things. There's a lot more to read about when you're thinking about consensus and governance within the Telos ecosystem, and I would encourage you to read a lot more, especially there's so many resources that the team have made available to all of us to continue reading and understanding, which will actually help us build some amazing products as well. And this image is basically just a rundown of what I've basically discussed when you're talking about governance being, or the changes that are made to governance being implemented by token holders through a referendum or through specific votes. And for you to actually have for your vote to have a higher weight, you realize that it's encouraged to vote for more than just a couple of producers. If you have more than 20 plus, you'll find that your decision or your thoughts would actually hold a lot more weight within this particular ecosystem. Then the rules for enforcing this governance structure, like I mentioned before, are actually just set within the smart contract themselves. Now, the smart contract that we discussed being implemented at the beginning. Then, token holders can also vote for any other worker proposals in the Telos ecosystem, not just in terms of block producers, which is actually pretty key. And then what allows us to actually implement more robust governance features is now what I refer to briefly as Telos Decide, which I'll also continue to talk about more as we continue with this particular session. Just seeing a couple of more questions coming in through the chat. Thank you for that. I think I'll be able to address that as well. And also members of the team will also just continue to drop in more information in the chat as we continue. And just like as I've discussed about Telos Decide, you'll find that this whole ecosystem basically is what enables this to be the first blockchain overseen by arbiters chosen by its members. And that's actually a huge point when you talk about this being a purely decentralized network. So yeah, so finally here we go in terms of talking about Telos Decide and what exactly it is. And it's basically an on-chain governance engine exclusively for the Telos blockchain network. So it offers you a set of voting services and other dark or DAO tools that both users and developers can actually take advantage of, which is actually pretty cool, and I think gives a lot of potential in terms of the different applications and things that people can actually do within the network. So just opening up that link just so you can also check it out briefly, but just talking more about how this would look or how it would work, you'd find that there are lots of features that are offered within this or within Telos Decide itself. And one of the first things in terms of secure ballot hosting, whereby any user of the network can create and publish a public ballot hosted through Telos Decide. And these ballots, which are created or can be published, basically you also have the opportunity to select the token you want to use for counting votes. There is already a default vote token that's basically the standard, but you can also set your own, which is actually pretty cool. Then in terms of implementing advanced voting methods, maybe there are actually other things that you'd like to consider in terms of what you want to vote for, and thankfully you're actually given this opportunity through the different ballot options that you'd be given access to, which I won't get into right now at the moment, but like I mentioned before, as we share these links to the docs and other resources, you find that you can actually learn so much more about this, and it's actually pretty robust. Then another thing would now be in terms of custom token treasuries. Basically what it says is that any user may create a custom token that automatically inherits Telos Decide's entire suite of voting services. And these treasuries that you basically come up with or build are what will allow you now to basically govern the minting and distribution of tokens, and also be customized to allow to basically disallow specific behaviors in terms of maybe you don't want people transferring specific tokens or reclaiming them, maybe based on specific conditions or amount of time, whatever depends on you. And just thinking about it, you find that there's so many different implementations that you can actually leverage this in order to actually bring them into life. Then the final thing is in terms of traceable vote integrity, whereby Telos Decide's custom rebalance system allows workers to recalculate vote weights when a voter's token balance changes. So workers who perform this service are eligible for payment rewards in proportion to the amount of work that they've performed compared to all other workers in the specific treasury. So it's a bit fair in terms of that, in terms of just making sure everything is equally distributed as well, which is some of the key things that we look at, that we talk about when we talk about now traceability and voter integrity as well. So still a number of other things that you can look at in terms of the different features that you have available to you through Telos Decide. Another thing is now in terms of actually setting up an integrated payroll system. So since all treasuries created on the platform have access to Telos Decides payroll system, managers can continually fund operations within their own treasury. Then there's also tools for managing committees where there's a sort of committee creation and management actions that are available to any token treasury and its voters. Then you can also have light ballots, which basically disable the on-chain vote tracking portion of the voting process, basically allowing for developers to track votes in an off-chain database that is built by Iris, DMAX, or Spectrum style service instead, which basically just gives you different options in terms of how you actually want to conduct your ballots, depending on your particular needs and use cases as well. Then the final thing is the fact that these are profitable worker services. So basically, there are basically a lot of janitorial actions, or basically cleaning up specific things within the ecosystem, and it's done in a way that incentivizes the workers who actually do this to maintain an optimized voting system and who are paid proportionally for their work, as we had mentioned before as well. So just continuing on that note as well, you find that I've talked about the governance structure a bit in depth, but there's also the whole consensus aspect of it in terms of this is the way in which distributed nodes and users agree upon the current state of the blockchain. And the consensus or Telos is basically referred to as a distributed proof of stake, or a BFT, as you may call it as well. So those are just some of the things that you can consider when thinking or looking at, okay, when you hear about consensus mechanisms, you just know Telos and DPoS. And before I even get into the nitty-gritties of the distributed proof of stake, you'll find that there are lots of other consensus mechanisms that we interact with in the blockchain space. And maybe it might help for those who are a bit new to the particular topics to understand that the DPoS basically came after a couple of others. So everyone is basically aware of, or if you're not, and you're just getting started in the blockchain space, you'll know that Bitcoin runs on the proof of work consensus mechanism, whereby miners solve complex puzzles in order to add blockchains or blocks onto their chain. However, the challenge with this is that number one, it's very computationally expensive. As the network continues to grow, you'll find that you need more and more resources in order for you just to produce blocks. And that in turn brought up an issue in terms of the energy use, whereby the higher level of energy use has a negative effect in terms of the environment as well, which became a big issue within the blockchain space a couple of years ago, and actually still is until this point, which is why chains like Telos, which you now find is referred to as possibly one of the more green or chains within the blockchain ecosystem, is actually an amazing thing, because it's not as simple to achieve just thinking about it like that. And also because of this, the speed of processing these transactions isn't as fast as now in actual blockchains that use different or basically proof of stake consensus mechanisms. So that's basically where we started. Now there's also the proof of stake mechanisms themselves, whereby block producers are chosen depending on their stake of tokens. Basically, the more tokens you have, the more likely you are to be allowed to produce blocks within the ecosystem. However, you'll find that the challenge with this is that you find that it can reach a point where a small proportion of users have such a huge control of the stake within the blockchain, which is not a good thing. So the energy that is required is limited to the amount of blocks that they can produce in the proof of stake. So it is slightly better than the proof of works. However, the challenge now would be in terms of the potential of specific number of users to have a majority of the tokens as well. It's significantly faster than proof of work, but you'll find that the DPoS, or distributed proof of stake consensus mechanism, actually has a lot of other advantages on top of what the POS already has. Number one is in terms of the democratization of the blockchain, as well as the fairness that actually exists, whereby it's less likely for a smaller amount of users to own majority of the stake within the blockchain, whereby each token holder is constantly voting for the block producers who are worthy of the task. So meaning, it doesn't matter how much you may have, your vote will still count in terms of selecting the different block producers as well. One good thing about it in terms of safety is that it protects the equality of the block producers by an inversely weighted voting system, which is what I mentioned before in terms of the more producers you vote for, the more weight is given to your vote. But if you vote for less, maybe like 1, 2, 3, 4 block producers, the weight of your vote is actually reduced. So this also includes the equity in terms of payment for the block producers' work, which is actually a key thing. And in terms of conserving the environment, or ESG as we may call it, you'll find that this actually has a more positive impact on the environment compared to something like proof of work, which is very high energy use at the same time. And one thing you'll find that through this, transactions are also proven faster or confirmed faster, meaning that even the overall efficiency of this chain goes up significantly through the use of distributed proof of stake, which is actually one of the key selling points or things that we look at when we talk about this particular consensus mechanism. I'm seeing another question from Kelvin in terms of, does the network only allow building DAO on it, or is that the topic of today? In terms of the topic of today, I'm just talking about consensus mechanisms and the basic architecture of the Telos EVM. So yes, you can implement DAOs within this particular ecosystem, but you're not limited to that. There's so many other things that you can build and that you can implement using Telos that you would find that would have such, you have the room to be creative basically. So I'm actually pretty interested to see what you'll be able to build for this particular hackathon as well. And I'll just briefly talk about the consensus process. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but I think it's just a couple of points here and there that I think are important for all of us to know. And I think one of the key things is in terms of knowing that consensus in Telos will basically happen in two different steps. In terms of the producer voting and scheduling, which is now performed by the DPoS, which is now the layer 2 of now Telos, then the production of the blocks and their validation, which is actually performed on the Telos native network, which is now maybe what we refer to as Telos 0 in this particular sense. So these two processes are independent and can be executed in parallel. So basically the first one is how do you actually select the people producing this block, and in what order will they be producing them in, which is pretty simple. Just a brief comment, I've seen what Nathan has mentioned in the chat in terms of DAO being just one of the potential use cases, which is actually very true, and it's something that we're going to be talking about as we continue this particular bootcamp, where you'll learn that there's so many different things that you can build and implement on Telos, which is actually the beautiful thing about it as well. So I'll just briefly talk about layer 1, the Telos 0 side, which is basically just the native part of Telos. It's not the huge focus of the whole bootcamp, but it's just good to know a couple of things in terms of how it operates. And basically what it does is it plays a crucial role in terms of deciding which blocks in the blockchain should be considered final and permanently recorded. So it will receive a schedule of producers who had been voted for on the layer 2, which I'll just talk about more in depth as we continue. And they're basically the people that the users of the Telos network have trusted and made them responsible for creating and validating blocks in the blockchain. And the schedule is now used to make sure that these blocks are correctly signed by the right producers in order to ensure the security and integrity of the blockchain. So basically refer to this part as BFT. You can read more about this. It's nothing too complex unless you want to go like into the in-depth mathematical concepts that are involved, but it's pretty simple to understand. It's basically just a way we ensure that you protect against potential issues or attacks within this particular setup. And there are basically two stages of confirming a block using this. The first one is when you're producing the last irreversible block, or the LIB. So this at this stage, what we propose is a special block, which is a point in the blockchain where transactions become permanent and cannot be changed. So this is the first thing that needs to be submitted. And the next thing would be, after this block can no longer be changed, we need to confirm against the block producers whether this block is valid, and they basically make it final and irrevocable, basically adding it on top of the chain. And that's basically the two-step process of how the BFT implements the block production. And once a block goes through both stages, it means that it can no longer be changed and is permanently added to the blockchain and can no longer be altered as well. And the second layer, in terms of what I talked about, is this is where we decide who are the people who are going to be producing new blocks within the Telos ecosystem. And also another thing is in terms of how are they basically, let me say, rewarded as well. So the main token that is used is the Telos token for transactions and various activities within the system. So what will happen is people can basically lock up some of their tokens away to say that, hey, I'm committed to Telos and I trust this network, so here's my tokens. Basically, I'm staking them, per se. And these holders are the people who can now vote for individuals or groups to help make important decisions in the system. So maybe you don't want to vote yourself for something that is happening on the network. And basically what you can also do is allow someone to vote for you, which is what I'm now referring to as proxying, per se. Maybe you want to come up as a group and you say, hey, you can vote on behalf of us. That's cool, let me be your proxy. That's basically what's happening here. And one thing to note is, over time, maybe you're not interacting with the network as much or voting on specific decisions. Your voting power might also decrease because of this. So it actually promotes people interacting within the network, and also basically making sure that their voice is heard, is what I would say. Like, participation is one of the core principles of the whole Web3 ecosystem. And I think this is one of the most important aspects in terms of you're part of a community, so make sure you also help make decisions that actually affect the community as a whole. Then the people who want to help run the system are what we call the block producers, like I mentioned before, and they're basically ranked based on the votes that they receive from token holders. Once they get these votes is when now they can now start producing blocks within the network. And what happens basically is the system creates new tokens as a reward for block producers, similar to any other blockchain. So the more blocks you produce, the more tokens you receive because of the work that you've done, basically just to incentivize you to continue to secure and maintain the network. So a regular round for producing, blocks would be around 2 minutes. And within a scheduled round, each block producer gets a 6-second turn to create and confirm up to 12 blocks. Basically just giving more details in terms of how this would work in that setting. It also uses smart contracts written in WASM to automate and enforce its rules. So WASM is basically WebAssembly. It's basically a low-level language that now computers understand to process specific instructions. Just to mention about that briefly. And basically that was it for me. Just giving you a brief introduction into what we talk about or what we mean when you think about consensus and when you think about governance in Telos. Thank you for all the questions that I've been seeing in the chats, but if there's anything else that anyone wants to know, just continue asking, I'm definitely just going to keep referencing and seeing what other information you may want to have. And at this point, I'll just make a couple of announcements. So tomorrow we'll get more into the technical sides of how do you actually interact with the Telos network, how do I set up my wallet, how do I go about receiving tokens or test tokens that I can use for testing out my smart contracts and how they interact with my dApps. Then from then on, we'll also look at how do we actually write and deploy Solidity smart contracts onto the Telos testnet, just in preparation for the hackathon that we'll be doing next week. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing all your amazing projects. As we mentioned before, you can interact with us in the Telegram groups. If you need any support, myself, Nathan, and team are there to help you as much as we can, in case you have any questions or challenges, just to help you get it started in your projects as well. Like I mentioned, if you still have a couple of friends who are interested in the hackathon next week, the registration is still open. You can find all those links in our social medias or community groups as well. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you can actually build and interacting with you a lot more as well. So if there are no other questions, I think I'll just end today's session there. It's amazing always interacting with you. I love talking about blockchain, Telos, and actually the amazing things we can build. So it's also exciting and fun for me to do this as well. And I can't wait to actually connect with you tomorrow as well. So thank you, everyone. Have an amazing evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are. And I will see you tomorrow. So cheers, guys. Yes, just briefly, I've seen a question. Yes, the recordings are available within our YouTube channel as well. So if there's anything you want to know or refer back to, you can